The isolated Wittman family of Kentucky. In the summer of 1965, a young social worker named Margaret Henley drove down a dirt road in rural Kentucky, one that no map showed. She was investigating reports about children who had never learned to speak, not due to an inability, but because their family hadn't used a complete sentence in over a century. What she discovered behind the rusted gate of the Wittman property was something that would haunt her forever. The children communicated only with primitive gestures and grunts. Their eyes were too close together, and their skulls were misshapen. When Margaret questioned the oldest family member about their condition, the woman simply pointed to a crooked family portrait on the wall. The faces of 7 generations looked unnervingly identical, as though the same person had been photographed repeatedly over 140 years. Hello everyone. Before we begin, please make sure to subscribe and like the channel, and tell us where you're from and what time it is for you in the comments. This helps YouTube continue showing you videos like this one. The genesis of isolation. The story starts in 1823 when Jeremiah Wittman purchased 847 isolated acres in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. The deed, still held in the Harlan County Courthouse, shows Jeremiah paid only $37 for land that other settlers wouldn't touch. The Cherokee who previously lived there considered the land cursed, and local farmers muttered that the hollow between the mountains would never yield anything good. Jeremiah ignored the superstitions. He was a religious man who thought isolating his family from the outside world would safeguard them from sin. He built a cabin deep in the woods, accessible only via a single winding path that he intentionally hid from travelers. His wife, Sarah, bore him 12 children in that remote cabin, far from neighbors, doctors, or anyone who might question the choices they were about to make. The closed genetic loop. By 1845, their eldest son, Thomas, was of marrying age, but there were no suitable wives within 50 miles. Traveling to the nearest town meant a treacherous 3-day mountain journey. Jeremiah decided that rather than sending Thomas into the outside world, a choice that would affect 7 generations, he encouraged him to marry his own sister, Rebecca. Jeremiah declared himself a minister of his own invented faith and conducted the ceremony himself. No official government records exist of this union. However, the family Bible, later found by investigators, had an entry in Jeremiah's handwriting, Thomas wed to Rebecca, both pure of blood and spirit, sealed before God in holy union May 15, 1845. Between 1846 and 1852, Rebecca gave birth to 4 children, 3 survived infancy. Neighbors who occasionally saw them from a distance noted they appeared strange. They rarely left the family's boundaries, communicating mainly through primitive sounds and gestures. Genetic decline and loss of speech. By 1850, the pattern was set. The Wittman family had become a closed genetic loop, with cousins marrying cousins, brothers marrying sisters, and uncles marrying nieces. They defended this practice through a distorted view of biblical scripture, claiming God intended them to maintain a pure bloodline, uncontaminated by outsiders. The first signs of genetic deterioration surfaced in the 3rd generation around 1875. Children began displaying what local doctors would later call profound developmental abnormalities. Their skulls were narrow and elongated, and their eyes were set too close, creating an unsettling, almost predatory look. Most alarming was the loss of their capacity for speech. Dr. Edmund Curthers, the only physician brave enough to visit the property, kept detailed notes found after his 1923 death. His observations depict a disturbing, real-time genetic collapse. They grunt and gesture like animals, he wrote in his journal on September 12, 1876. He noted they seemed to grasp simple commands but had not heard any of them speak a single full word. The oldest boy, around 16, communicated only with guttural sounds and pointing. What Dr. Curthers witnessed was the destruction of the family's linguistic abilities. Inbreeding had damaged the brain areas responsible for language comprehension and speech development. Each generation showed worsening impairment, as if their DNA was slowly eliminating the very qualities that define humanity. Primitive existence. The family developed a crude form of communication, a mix of facial expressions, grunts, and gestures, to convey basic emotions and needs. An older member might point to their mouth and make a low moan to signal hunger. Children would urgently grunt while tugging on parents' clothes when they needed to relieve themselves. Abstract concepts and complex thoughts had become impossible to express. By the 1880s, the Wittman family had basically reverted to a prelinguistic state. They lived like intelligent animals, capable of emotional responses and basic problem solving, but unable to share in the fundamental human experience of language. Their existence centered on immediate physical necessities: survival, reproduction, shelter, and food. Neighbors living miles away began reporting strange, haunting vocalizations echoing through the mountains at night, neither animal cries nor fully human voices. These sounds became local folklore, with parents warning children not to go near Wittman Hollow after dark, claiming the sounds could cause madness if heard for too long. Escalating deformity and isolation. The fourth generation, born in the 1890s, marked a critical shift in the family's decline. Physical deformities, once subtle, were now impossible to miss. Children were born with severe cleft palates that made even primitive grunting difficult. Their limbs developed unevenly, some had arms much longer than their legs, and others had hands that looked more like claws. Census records from 1900 offer a chilling glimpse of their state. The count listed 14 individuals, from infants to elderly, but the census taker noted he could not get coherent replies from anyone. He described the encounter as deeply unsettling, recommending the property be bypassed in the future. The census taker had seen a family that had lost not only the ability to communicate but also the capacity for basic social behaviors and human hygiene. Children ran naked through the woods, covered in dirt and scars from fighting each other for food. They had developed a pack mentality, with the strongest members using violence and intimidation to dominate weaker siblings. Their isolation was now complete. They no longer traveled to nearby towns for supplies, subsisting instead on whatever they could forage, hunt, or grow in their increasingly desolate garden plots. Their diet was mostly wild animals they caught with their bare hands: squirrels, rabbits, and sometimes larger prey, which they would consume raw, having lost the knowledge of how to properly cook meat. Local authorities were aware of the situation but were hesitant to intervene. The property sat in a legal gray area between counties, and no sheriff wanted responsibility for what they privately saw as a family that had devolved beyond help. Whispers of removing the children or forced sterilization occurred, but never led to action. Savagery and extinction of language. By 1905, the family had created a primitive social structure based entirely on reproductive capability and physical strength. The strongest male would claim the most fertile females, irrespective of familial ties. Weaker members were forced to the group's margins, often dying from exposure during harsh winters or of neglect, left to scavenge for scraps. The fifth generation, appearing in the 1920s, represents perhaps the most tragic period of this genetic nightmare. These children were born into a world where human language was already entirely extinct within their family line. They had no idea complex communication was even possible. To them, their gestures and grunts were the full and natural extent of human expression. In 1924, Dr. Helena Morrison, a University of Kentucky psychiatrist, secretly observed the family from a distance. Her field notes, found in university archives in 1987, described children who behaved and moved more like a pack of wild dogs than people. They hunt in groups, she wrote, with younger ones learning through mimicking the older ones. I watched them corner and kill a deer using only brute force and coordination. The youngest, about 7 years old, bit into the animal's throat while it was still alive. Complete moral collapse. The family's reproductive patterns grew increasingly disturbing and chaotic. With no understanding of family relationships or social taboos, children began reproducing as soon as they reached physical maturity. Mothers with sons, fathers with daughters, and siblings with siblings mated, all completely unaware that these relationships violated basic human norms. Reproduction, for them, was just another biological function, like sleeping or eating. The physical decline continued to accelerate. Children of the fifth generation were frequently born with severe mental disabilities, improperly functioning organs, or missing limbs. Many died within their first few years, their bodies simply unable to sustain the accumulated genetic errors. The few who survived to adulthood did so via a kind of savage natural selection that rewarded only the most physically resilient. Local legends from this time told of encounters with family members who had strayed off the property. A traveling salesman reported being attacked by a creature that moved like a wild animal but looked human and sounded like a wounded bear. Hunters claimed to have seen children with eyes that glowed in the dark, watching them from the tree line, communicating with a series of whistles and clicks that terrified them. The original family cabin had long since crumbled. The fifth generation lived in crude shelters constructed from animal hides, branches, and salvaged material. They had lost the ability to make fire, create tools, or use basic construction techniques. Their ancestors' attempt to preserve racial purity had instead stripped away every advancement that separated them from wild animals. The sixth generation and government intervention. If you're still watching, you're clearly more courageous than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your own bloodline. The sixth generation, born in the 1940s and 1950s, pushed the limits of what could still be considered human. The genetic damage was so severe that many struggled with basic motor functions. Their brains developed abnormally, leaving them with intelligence levels later compared by researchers to those of higher primates, yet without the natural instincts animals possess to thrive in the wild. World War II led to increased government focus on remote Appalachian areas as military recruiters sought eligible young men. In 1943, Lieutenant James Hartwell, a recruitment officer, became the first official government representative on the Wittman property in over 50 years. His report, classified until 1978, describes an encounter that made him question his sanity. I found about 20 individuals living in what can only be called subhuman conditions, Hartwell wrote. They didn't recognize my authority or my uniform. Several younger ones approached me on all fours, sniffing my boots and making sounds I can't adequately put into words. When I tried to speak, pointing to myself and saying, "American soldier," they tilted their heads like confused dogs and merely mimicked my gestures, showing no apparent understanding. Genetic catastrophe. The lieutenant's report sparked a secret investigation by the Department of Health and Human Services. A team of social workers, geneticists, and researchers was put together to study what they internally called the Kentucky situation. Their findings, contained in a classified, 847-page document, painted a picture of genetic catastrophe unparalleled in American history. The sixth generation had developed physical characteristics that seemed to defy human evolution. Their skulls were elongated to hold brains that, despite being enlarged, functioned at a fraction of a normal capacity. Their limbs were disproportionately long, giving them a spider-like appearance that even seasoned researchers found unsettling. Most shocking was the development of what seemed to be vestigial tails, small bony protrusions at the base of their spines, suggesting their DNA was regressing to an earlier evolutionary state. The family's social structure had completely dissolved. There was no division of labor, no recognizable family units, and no sharing of resources. Every individual existed in a state of continuous competition with the others, fighting over mating opportunities, shelter, and food with a near-psychotic intensity. The end of the bloodline. The seventh and final generation began to appear in the early 1960s. These children were the final result of 140 years of genetic isolation, human beings who were stripped of nearly everything that made them human, yet who somehow endured in their mountain prison. Margaret Henley's arrival in 1965 signaled the end for the Wittman bloodline. As a social worker specializing in child welfare, she had encountered abuse, poverty, and neglect throughout rural Kentucky, but nothing in her training could have prepared her for what she found in that hidden hollow. Her first encounter happened on a scorching July morning. She parked her car at the end of the overgrown dirt road and hiked nearly 2 miles through dense forest to reach the remains of what had once been a homestead. The structures she found barely qualified as shelters: crude lean-tos made from rotting wood, animal bones, and rusted metal sheets, arranged in patterns that looked like some primitive ritual. 11 individuals emerged from these shelters like wild animals reacting to an intruder, ranging from what appeared to be infants to elderly adults, though their severe deformities made accurate age assessment almost impossible. Their movements were coordinated but inhuman. They approached her in a semicircle, making low humming sounds that seemed to convey information about the level of threat she posed. What startled Margaret most was their utter lack of curiosity about her presence, more than their already disturbing appearance. Normal children, even neglected ones, would have shown some interest in her supplies, her car, or her clothing. These children looked at her with the same detached assessment that predators use to evaluate potential prey. They showed no excitement, no fear, and no recognition that she represented a world beyond their isolated existence. Margaret's attempts to communicate were met with total incomprehension. When she spoke, they made clicking sounds with their tongues and tilted their heads. When she offered them food from her bag, they immediately snatched it and began fighting over it, with the strongest members claiming the largest portions. There was no sharing, no cooperation, and no acknowledgement that they were a family unit. Most heartbreaking was her realization that these children had no concept of their own humanity. They had never heard music, seen mirrors, or experienced the basic human pleasures of play or storytelling. Their world was composed entirely of biological needs and survival instincts. Operation Mountain Recovery. Margaret Henley's report led to the largest humanitarian intervention in Kentucky state history. Within 6 weeks of her first visit, a joint task force of law enforcement officers, social workers, medical professionals, and geneticists descended upon the Wittman property. What they found there would traumatize every person involved for the rest of their lives. The operation, codenamed Mountain Recovery, was conducted in total secrecy. Government officials feared that public knowledge of the family's condition would cause panic about genetic contamination or encourage copycat isolationist communities. On August 15, 1965, the children were removed from the property and immediately transported to a specialized medical facility in Lexington that had been cleared of all other patients. Dr. Robert Steinberg, the lead geneticist, later described the children as living fossils of human devolution. Blood tests revealed genetic abnormalities so severe that they challenged the existing understanding of human DNA's resilience limits. The children's chromosomes showed damage patterns suggesting their genetic code was literally unraveling, with each succeeding generation inheriting increasingly corrupted biological instructions. Rehabilitation efforts were largely unsuccessful. The younger children, under the age of 10, showed a limited capacity for learning basic gestures and simple hygiene, but complex learning remained impossible due to their abnormally developed brains. They could be taught to eat with rudimentary utensils and use toilets, but abstract thinking, language acquisition, and emotional development were permanently out of reach. The older members of the seventh generation were deemed beyond any possibility of integrating into normal society. They remained institutionalized for the rest of their lives in specialized facilities, where they were studied by researchers trying to comprehend the outer limits of human genetic damage. Most died before they reached age 40, their bodies finally succumbing as the accumulated genetic errors overwhelmed their biological systems. The Cursed Hollow. The Wittman property was quietly confiscated by the federal government and designated a biological hazard zone. All structures were burned. The land was fenced off, and official records of the family's existence were destroyed or classified. The few social workers and researchers who had direct contact with the family were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that remained in effect until their deaths. Today, the hollow between the mountains is empty and forgotten. Local residents have their own folklore, claiming the land is still cursed and that strange sounds can still be heard echoing through the trees on quiet nights. But the truth is more disturbing than any ghost story. The Wittman family provides proof that human civilization is much more fragile than we want to believe and that the boundary between humanity and something else entirely can be crossed in just a few generations of genetic damage and isolation. Their story serves as a stark warning about the consequences of extremism, isolation, and the dangerous belief that purity can be preserved by destroying diversity. In his attempt to create something perfect, Jeremiah Wittman instead created something that was no longer recognizably human at all.